Hey guys, my name is Autumn Darden and I'm friends with Barb McGatlin, and she asked if I would share my testimony with you all. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and what the Lord has done, knowing full well that anything that He does for one person, He'll do for anyone else who seeks after Him. My story starts as a little girl in South Carolina, and I was born to a Christian couple who had already had one child, and then I was born, and we were in the church all the time. The doors were open, we were there. But not too many years into my childhood, I like to say that my childhood was hijacked, and I was introduced to some very adult things by some older kids and teenagers. And that began something that lasted for the next 8 years of my life. And it was kind of like a secret life that I was living this double, as a kid, I was living this double life of church, but then things were going on at home that were not right. And so because of that, at age 13, I became pregnant by a family member. And that kind of blew the lid off of the secret. And so the whole family found out what was going on, and they had to figure out what to do with me. And they decided, by that time we had moved to another state and a small town, and so they decided to try to keep it a secret as best they could and sent me off to the big city. And there at a maternity home, I decided that the best thing for the baby would be to place him in a home with a mom and a dad and the chance to have siblings. And so in 1995, at age 13, I gave birth to a little boy and placed him for adoption. I got to spend 4 days with him, and that's kind of a long time, and that kind of scared everybody, thinking that maybe I would change my mind. But I knew what was best for him was not to bring him into the chaos that was my life and my family. And so I placed him in the arms of the caseworker and got in the car with my parents and cried all the way home. And I like to say that for the next year and a half, I just cried all the time. I cried myself to sleep. I felt hopelessness. I felt worthless. I felt a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. The things that had been going on since I was just a little girl that I participated in and willingly participated in. The weight of that shame and that guilt was unbearable. And then, on top of that, the enemy just starts talking and telling you you're worthless, you're gross, you're dirty, your life's never going to get better, you're a burden to your family, they'd be better off without you. And even though I was seeing a counselor, I started believing those things. I believed the lie that life was never going to get better. And I did have one little thought, though, from growing up in church, that if I could just get back to church, maybe God could help me. And so it took some convincing. My parents kind of just kept me home, kept me out of school for several months because they didn't want anyone to find out. And I enlisted my sister, who was 2 years younger than me, to basically gang up on my parents, and we begged them, please just take us to church. Please just take us to church. And finally, my parents gave in, and they said, okay, fine, we'll take you to church, but you cannot tell anybody what has happened. And so there's a little church that we had attended off and on over the years, about 3 miles down the road from our house on a gravel road. And my parents one day just drove up, dropped us off. And when we walked in the doors, there were pastors there that were different than the pastors the last time we had been there. And there was something really different about them. The pastor's wife just fully embraced, like right when we walked in the door, it was like she was just like so happy to see us there. And she became the pastor's wife became a safe person for me to reach out to. And I remember just after a couple of weeks, they would have an altar call. And I'd never been in a church that had an altar call or at the end of church. And it wasn't like, if you want to receive Jesus, come down to the altar. It was, if you want to get prayer about anything, come to the altar. And so I did. I was 14 years old at that point, and I walked down to the altar. And we hadn't known each other very long. And I just looked at her, and I knew that I could tell her what happened. And I told her, I said, I just had a baby a few months ago. I feel hopeless. And she didn't blink. She didn't go, oh, what? She just looked at me and she said, you know what? We're going to pray right now. And she grabbed my hands and we held hands and we bowed our heads. And she said, Jesus, I thank you so much for Autumn, and I just believe that you're going to restore her life, and one day she's going to have a husband and a family of her own. And that just began a trust relationship with her. After that, I never missed a service. I was in church all the time, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. If church doors were open, I was there, and I began to seek the Lord. But continued to battle the darkness. And just a few months later, had a really, really bad day. My home that I lived in with my parents and siblings was very chaotic. And my mom and I got in an argument, got in a fight, and I was like, that's it. I can't hardly even keep my head above water. I feel like I'm never going to get out of this pit. The more I try to get out of this pit, the more exhausted I am, the more hopeless I am. And so I took every pill I could find in the house and in the cars. I ransacked the house and found every pill I could find and took all of them. Later that night, I ended up in the hospital in ICU. And because both of my parents worked nights, I ended up there by myself. And throughout the night, I had a lot of time to think. There's definitely no sleeping in there. And all the beeping and bells and whistles going off and all the things with your heart rate, and they're watching for everything. I came to the conclusion that I really didn't want to die, but I needed to know how to live. No one had ever taught me how to live, and that's what I really wanted. I want someone to just teach me how to live. And the next morning, a psychiatrist came in, and with his clipboard, and he started asking me all kinds of questions, and then he stopped, and he just looked me right dead in the eyes, and he said, "Are you ever going to do this again?" And I said, "No, sir, I am never going to try this again." And he wrote something on his paper, and he left. And I got discharged later that day, which doesn't happen. I can tell you that. It does not happen. And I think that was the saving grace of God, to not be put in a psych ward, but be put right back in that little tiny church with those pastors. And later that day, when I was at home, I received a balloon and a card from those pastors. And in the little note cards, it said, "Autumn, we know you've been through a rough time, but we want you to know we're praying for you and we love you." And that was honestly the first time someone had told me that they love me, and I could believe it. I believed it. I knew that they really did love me. I continued to go to church and receive prayer at the end of services. God was doing a deep work in my life. There were a lot of times where there was a lot of tears, a lot of snot, snot and tears, as God just pulled those things that I was ashamed of just out, and the things that I was guilty about out. And a few months later, I was in a service, and that night the pastor said, "If you want prayer, come on down the altar." And I walked down to the altar, and he's going down the line praying for people. And when he got to me, he just said one word: forgiveness. And it was as if he punched me in the stomach. Now, the pastor did not punch me in the stomach, but that word was so powerful. He said, "Forgiveness." And when he said that, I doubled over like this and began to sob. And simultaneously, as I began to sob, I saw the people I needed to forgive that I didn't even know I was holding unforgiveness towards. And two of those people were my parents. And it was shocking to me because I didn't realize I was holding them in unforgiveness, but I was because I was holding them responsible. And I was saying, where were you? Where were you when I was 5? Where were you when I was 6, when all of this was going on? And I immediately saw that I needed to forgive them. And in that moment, I released them. And the other person that I needed to forgive was the father of the baby. And I forgave him in that moment. And it was a very powerful moment for me, but the next day, it seemed like everything was the same. And I was still depressed. And that was Thursday. And then Friday, it was like the same thing. And then Saturday, it was like, yep, I'm still here. I'm still me. And Sunday morning came, and my sister Faith always came with me to church. And I had 3 younger siblings, and they were coming to church with me too. By that time, I think I was 15, and my parents would let me drive down to the church without my permit or without my license. And that morning, we all got out of the car. I had my brothers and sisters behind me, and I opened the church door, and there was standing a greeter, Dave. He was probably in his mid-60s, early 70s. And he said, "Hi, Autumn." And right as I said hi back, the power of God, wham, hits me like electricity. It was like being plugged in. Honestly, it was like being plugged in like a lamp, because it started at my toes. And it went through my entire body all the way up. And like every bit of heaviness came off of me. Every bit of shame came off of me. Every bit of guilt, shame, depression, it just left. And I lit up like a light bulb, and I started smiling like this, like just this huge cheesy smile. I'm walking around church like, "Hi everybody, hello," and I'm greeting everybody. Before that, I was pretty stoic. No facial expressions. It was really hard for me to make facial expressions. It was hard for me to laugh at things. I fake laughed a lot of times. There were a lot of times where I was in a crowd and I would fake laugh because I didn't want to stick out. But that day I was completely restored, completely set free from depression, suicidal thoughts, shame, and guilt. And the next day at school, I was in high school, my friends were like, "What happened to you? What happened to you?" And I didn't have any words for it other than God healed me. That's all I know. God healed me. And about 3 or 4 days later, as they're just still processing this different person that came back from the weekend completely different, they said at the lunch table, they're like, we don't know what happened to you, but we really like the new Autumn. And that was 20 something years ago. And I have never been the same since. I have gone through trials. I have gone through some pretty hard things, but God has never left my side, and the change has lasted. And now, the thing that I was so bound to, the depression and hopelessness that I could not get free from, now I'd like to say that it has never tried to come back, but it has tried to come back. But this time, it's like an outside force coming at me, and I can say, "Nope, not today. No, you cannot come any closer." Whereas before, I was in its grips, and I was powerless to do anything about it. And Jesus came and rescued my life. He came with power, with like lightning bolt power, and set me free. And I know that if any of you are dealing with that, if anyone of you know someone who is really, really struggling to have hope, really struggling to see that your life is ever gonna get any better, or just that you have purpose in life, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that God has a plan for you, and it's actually a really, really good plan, and it's gonna be good. You're gonna get to really live. You gotta give your life to Jesus. You got to let him take charge. You got to let him take over and him take control, and release everyone that's ever done anything wrong to you, or who should have been there and wasn't. Release them and just hand them over to the Lord and let him do a work in your life. Let him fill your heart new. And I know you're going to have a story to tell just like mine. So thanks for listening. And Barb, I love you. I hope you're doing well.